And officially welcome everybody. Good morning, everybody. I'm Bruce Black, Horticulture Educator for Carroll-Lee-Whiteside County, coming to you from a very rainy Northwest Illinois this morning. But I'm glad that you guys are able to join us. Today is going to be a little bit different as for the past 6 weeks, you've heard me start by presenting and going for a full hour. Today we're going to mix it up a little bit differently. And I've brought a special presenter in to do the first part of today's presentation. Candice Hart, who is our State Master Gardener Coordinator, is going to be presenting the first part of today's program for the Northern Berry School. And this is a program that Candice, Grant McCarty, and myself put together a few years ago, and we thought it was time to bring back. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Candice, and she'll be presenting the first part. And I did want to make just a couple of announcements for those teachers on who are looking for continuing education credits. I will be putting the link to the evaluation in the chat box, and please send those to me this week. Janice is unable to be with us, so my email will also be in the chat box. Please send your name and your IEIN number as well. And for our master volunteers, master gardeners, naturalists who are on, please enter your continuing education credit as you would in VCMS. With that, Candice is going to take questions at the end. So if you have questions, put them in the chat box, and I'll keep a running total for those questions at the end. And then her and I will switch, and I'll do half my presentation today. So with that, I will turn it over to Candice, and thanks for joining us today.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. Happy to be here to talk about berries today. Yeah, like Bruce said, we designed this program a couple years ago, and at the time I was living in Dixon, Illinois, so I was in Northern Illinois as well. Today I'm coming at you from Bloomington, Illinois, so central Illinois, but still very similar growing conditions. So I'm going to start us off with a quick poll to get us started. So I'm going to launch this poll. And if you wouldn't mind, just letting me know which berries that we're going to talk about today that you might already be growing. So go ahead and click those responses. Okay, we're over half of the people voted. Give it a little while longer. And you're right, Pete, I should have done a none option because I'm sure there are some of you who don't have any of these going there yet. And that's helpful to know. Okay, I'll give it 10 more seconds and then we'll see where we're at. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end it. So it looks like strawberries is our most popular berry that people are growing, followed by raspberries, blackberries, and then blueberries in last place. Well, thank you guys for polling on that. That's similar to what I imagined you would answer, so that is helpful. And we're gonna go through the introductions to all of those berries this morning. So if you're not growing any of them, or if you're only growing a few of them, hopefully you'll be enticed to try some of these after we go through some of these basics. So that's what we're going to kind of cover in this first part of this morning. Is we're going to go over just some basics about what are berries. We're going to go over some site basics of what you need to start a berry garden, and then we're going to go over specific kind of planting information for each of those 4 berries that we cover here in berry school. So just a quick kind of overview of what exactly are berries and what exactly are brambles. So we're going to be covering these two kind of groups of plants this morning, starting with what we call berries. So berries is kind of a broad term that obviously you've heard of a lot, but if we're talking about botanically speaking, if you're a botanist, what a berry is a fleshy fruit produced from a single ovary. So in terms of a flower, it's a very simple flower with one single ovary right below the flower. So there's actually a lot of fruits that are berries that you wouldn't think of as a berry because they don't have that term berry in the name. So a banana is a berry. Blueberries that we're going to talk about today are true berries. Grapes, pumpkins, tomatoes, any of those simple, just large, fleshy ovary fruits are commonly going to be botanically berries. So just a little bit of botany information for you. This doesn't really make any difference in terms of what you're planting, what you're not planting, but I myself am a little bit of a botany geek and plant geek, so I love to think about what kind of fruits different things are. So we're going to talk specifically about blueberries today, which are true berries, and we're also going to talk about strawberries and blackberries and raspberries, which botanically are not berries, even though they have the term berry in the name. So again, just kind of a fun fact for you. We're starting off with strawberries, which is a berry-like fruit. It's an aggregate of achenes, if you want to get technical in terms of botany language. So each of those little yellow seeds that you see on the outside of a strawberry, each of those is an achene, we call it. So those are all individual fruits compiled into one big fruit, basically. So enough of the botany talk. Oh, never mind, there's another one. We're going to go ahead and talk about brambles here quick too before we move to those. So you might hear the term brambles. That refers to any plants that are prickly shrubs in the genus Rubus. So for us, that specifically means blackberries and raspberries, what we're going to talk about. But there are certainly other brambles in that Rubus species. Different varieties, different cultivars. So you might hear of things like tayberries, boysenberries, loganberries, marionberries, olalaberries. Those are all types of rubus species that would also fall into those bramble category. But obviously those are less common, so we're not going to touch on those. We're going to focus on blackberries and raspberries. And again, they're not true berries in terms of botanical speak. They're aggregate fruits as well. Okay. Again, don't need to remember that, just kind of fun knowledge. So we're going to start off by talking about some of the benefits of growing small fruits. You're here today, so obviously you're already interested in growing fruit, which is great. So we're just going to touch on some of those benefits quick. Obviously, taste is a great benefit. When you can go outside, harvest it right off the plant, and eat it right away, you're getting it at the peak of harvest time and the peak of flavor. So obviously, that's a great benefit to growing your own. Availability is better typically when you can grow your own, especially if you're looking for a specific type of fruit, a specific variety. At the grocery store, at the farmer's market, obviously you're only going to be able to get what's sold there. You're going to be a little bit limited in terms of the variety. But when you can shop in a fruit catalog or you can buy plants at a garden center, you tend to have more varieties to pick from that you can grow yourself then and have a little bit more availability. Cost, of course, is a great benefit to growing your own food. You're going to have that initial cost of the plants and planting and time to get things going, but once established over the long term, you're typically going to save on cost versus buying fruit from a grocery store or farmer's market. And then I just think it's fun too to grow your own food, try different things, try things out. That's always, I think, a great benefit to any type of gardening that you're going to do. Is it's got to be fun. It's got to be worth it to do it. So hopefully you'll find that growing some of these fruits will also be fun to do. Okay, so a little bit about getting started with a berry garden. Obviously, your first choice is going to be, where am I going to put it? How big is it going to be? And what am I going to plant? So when you're thinking about the size of your planting, obviously you're going to think about what are your needs individually. Are you just wanting to grow enough fruit for your family to have some additional fruit, or are you wanting to grow for a farmer's market or a farm stand? Those are going to be different kind of sizing things that you're going to think about when you're getting started and picking your site. Whatever site you're picking, you want obviously a great fertile soil in a well-drained site. Any of the fruits we're going to talk about today do not like to sit in a low-lying, poorly drained area for long periods of time. It's going to cause many disease issues down the line, root rot issues, just for the overall health of those plants. It's not going to be an ideal site. So when you're looking at a potential site, take a look at the slope. If it has a little bit of elevation to it, a little bit of slope, or just very well-drained soil, that's going to be your ideal site for growing the fruits that we're talking about today, and most fruits in general. Okay, so think about that. You also want to think about convenience. If this is a home garden, just like your vegetable garden, you want it to be convenient so that you can get out there and harvest on a regular basis. You're not missing things that are ready to harvest. So being able to get out there frequently is going to be helpful. We're going to talk about some specific cultivars as we go through each of the fruits today, and how we want to make sure we're selecting cultivars that are adapted to our location. So Northern Illinois, Central, Southern, wherever you might be located, we want to make sure those cultivars are going to survive the winter and continue to grow for us. And then we're also going to make sure to talk about, with each one, making sure we're starting with high quality, healthy plants when we initially plant them. Viruses are one thing that can be a problem in the fruits that we're going to talk about. And sometimes you might purchase a plant that comes in that's already infected with a virus, which, if you're familiar with viruses, there's no cure for a virus. There's no sprays, there's no treatments. When a plant has a virus, it has a virus, so you typically have to dig it up and remove it. So making sure that we're starting with good, healthy plant stock, we're buying from a reputable company that's going to make sure we're starting with virus-free, healthy plants. Okay, so just a couple of tips on planning and getting started. Once you have that site selected, you've checked out the elevation, you've checked out the drainage, you maybe even got a soil test so that you know what the pH is and what your nutrient levels are. Now we can start to prepare that site for planting. Just with any garden, adding organic matter is going to be a great idea. So whether that's aged manure, leaf compost, grass clippings, any type of organic matter, whatever your preferred type of organic matter is going to be beneficial in most cases to add to that planting site. It's going to add nutrients. It might help your soil structure. So think about what type of organic matter you can add. We also want to think about what might have grown in that site previously. So for example, if you're taking a vegetable garden and converting it to a fruit garden, that may not be the ideal choice if that vegetable garden was just last year, for example. One of the pathogens that can be a problem with these fruit plants is verticillium wilt. And verticillium wilt's a very common soil pathogen. It affects many types of plants, but in particular, there's some vegetables that are rather prone to verticillium, like your tomatoes, your potatoes, peppers, eggplants, etc. So if that vegetable garden might have had some plants infected with verticillium wilt, it can persist in the soil for 3 to 5 years. So if I come in that next year and plant a fruit plant, I might risk having that fruit plant infected with verticillium wilt as well. So it's not you absolutely can't do that, but it's just something to keep in mind. If you've had potential verticillium wilt in that area previously, it may not be the best site for a fruit garden. I have a maple tree in my front yard right now that needs to be cut down because of verticillium wilt. So I know I'm not going to plant a fruit garden near where that tree has died. Okay. We also want to kill off what was growing there previously. So whether that's a lawn area that you're going to turn into a fruit garden, or if it's just a weedy patch, either way, we want to either turn over that turf to kill it off, use an herbicide to kill it off, sod cutter, whatever your kind of preferred method of bed prep is. We need to do that to kill off what's existing so that we don't have competition with our new fruit plants. Okay, and then lastly, I mentioned a soil test because knowing our pH in particular is going to be helpful for the fruit plants that we talk about today, specifically blueberries. So of the ones we talk about today, most prefer a slightly acidic soil, so a pH range of 5.5 to 7.5. So when you get a soil test, it's going to tell you exactly what that soil pH is. When we talk about blueberries in particular, they require a very acidic soil, 4.8 to 5.2. And I can almost guarantee if you get a soil test here in Illinois in most areas, it's certainly not going to be naturally at 4.8 to 5.2, which means that we have to do some amendments to get down to that lower pH, which we'll talk about. Okay. So we've got our site prepped. Now we're ready to start getting our plants and getting ready to plant. I mentioned earlier, we always want to get high quality plants to start with, getting those from a reputable company that we know has a good history of sending good plants. We want to make sure they're virus free to start with. You might also see when you're looking through catalogs and sources, you might note in some of them that they're listed as tissue culture plants. And what that is it's a method of being able to propagate plants in a sterile environment so that they can almost ensure 100% that they're virus-free plants to start with. So they're probably going to cost a little bit more in the catalog because that's a labor-intensive process and it requires time and labor. But it's a great way to be able to verify that you're starting with virus-free, very healthy plants. Okay. Ideally, so we're a little bit past this time now, but ideally, if you're planning ahead, it's a good idea to order your plants kind of as soon as you can, especially if you're looking for a specific variety that might sell out very quickly. So kind of in fall, winter, you start looking through those catalogs, looking through the online stores, and ordering at that point to ensure in the spring, once it's shipped to you, you can get what you really want. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get plants right now. You absolutely can. If you go to the garden center, and there's still a lot of garden catalogs and online stores that I'm sure have plenty available that you can still go out and buy right now. Okay, we're going to go through cultivars with each of the fruits we're going to look at today, because choosing cultivars is obviously an important part of the process. You want to select a cultivar that's going to be good for what you are wanting to use those fruits for. So for example, let's say strawberries and you're wanting to have the biggest, juiciest strawberry because you're going to eat them all fresh. You're going to eat them all as fresh strawberries. So you're going to select a cultivar that has probably a larger fruit size and a high kind of fresh eating quality. Or contrast that, you might be using those strawberries to make jams and jellies. That might be your purpose. If that's the case, you might choose a different type of strawberry. You might choose something that's smaller. It doesn't need to be large and juicy. It needs to be maybe smaller and more sweet. Okay, so you're always going to have kind of a personal choice and a personal preference of what cultivars you're going to go with. You also want to try to get disease resistance if possible with those cultivars. So when you're reading the descriptions on a particular cultivar, pay attention to what disease resistance is available. And obviously we want it to be winter hardy to your region. So when we look at them today, they're going to be listed by northern, central, and southern Illinois. When you're looking at a catalog, it's going to typically have the zone, the cold hardiness zone. So for myself here in Bloomington, Illinois, I'm zone 5. Most of northern Illinois is zone 5 as well, with a little bit of 4. So making sure you know what your hardiness zone is, and then purchasing plants that are appropriate to your hardiness zone so that they're going to come back for you next year. Also consider earlier and later cultivars. So for example, blueberries we'll look at, there are some early season blueberries, there's some later season. And what that does is it allows you to kind of have a longer extended harvest so that you're not having maybe a huge batch of blueberries in that early kind of zone and then you're done. Okay, if you plant both early and late season, you can have a little bit of a longer time of having fruit, which is nice. Here are a few sources. Obviously, we can't recommend one source over the other, but we can give you options and things to look at. These are a couple of online sources that you might consider looking for specific plant varieties. Of course, your local garden centers also tend to sell fruit plants of some varieties as well. So do some searching, do some shopping to be able to find the exact cultivars that you're looking for. Typically, those plants that you're going to get by mail order, so from catalogs or online stores, typically those plants were dug in the fall and they've held them in cold storage until they're ready to ship to you. So typically what you're going to get is a bare root plant. So it's not going to be in a pot, it's just going to be a root system. So you want to soak that in a tub of water or a bucket of water for a couple hours when you initially get it so that it can take up water again. And then you're going to get those planted as soon as you can after they've arrived. So in the spring, right now is a great time to get things out there. We're warm now. The soil has warmed up. Really, all you're looking for right now is just to make sure it's not too wet. Okay, and as we speak, it's raining outside my window, so I would probably want to wait a couple days, let the soil dry out a little bit, and then go ahead and get my fruit plants planted. Okay. So now we're going to break down into each of these 4 types of plants here. So starting with strawberries. Strawberries are in the genus Fragaria, and we have 3 different types of strawberries that you can find on the market. Okay, most of us are probably familiar with the June bearing type of strawberry where we have that one crop in late spring, and that's it. You get one big flush of flowers, one big flush of fruit, and there's your strawberries for the year. And you tend to have a very good yield from that, but they're just all at one time. The next type is called everbearing, and this is where we have several flushes of flowers and fruits throughout the season. So instead of having them all at one time, those flushes are kind of spaced out throughout the year. And then lastly, you have some day neutral varieties, which flower and fruit continuously through the growing season, unless it gets too hot. Okay, once you get to kind of the hot part of summer, they tend to kind of just sit there and not fruit and flower until the temperatures cool down a little bit. Okay, so you can either have that one big crop of strawberries all at once in late spring, or you can choose other varieties and extend that out a little bit later in the season. Okay, so here's a chart. This comes from our Master Gardener Manual, but you can also find this on our strawberry website, which I'll share at the end here. But here's some examples of some strawberry cultivars recommended for Illinois. So you'll see we have a long list of June-bearing options there, different fruit sizes, different disease-resistant options, and then where it is adapted. So you'll see all of those are adapted to northern Illinois, not necessarily all of them for central or southern. And then there's 2 options there recommended for day neutral varieties. So if you did want to try some of those that flower and fruit at other times, you can try some of those day neutral options. So as I mentioned, it's a personal preference in terms of cultivar. You're choosing based on when they're going to mature. Is it for fresh eating? Is it for preserving? And then what kind of disease resistance can you also get along with that cultivar? Okay. The site in particular for strawberries is going to be typical kind of good garden soil with a high level of soil fertility. So getting that soil test is going to be helpful to know what your fertility levels are. Adding organic matter is going to be helpful. And then your ideal pH for those strawberries is going to be 5.5 to 6.5. So again, that soil test can tell you what your pH is and let you know if you're in that ideal range. Planting, you're going to plant those as soon in the spring as you can. So once you get those plants in the mail or you get them from the garden center, you can go ahead and get them in the ground unless the soil is too wet. You want to let it dry out a little bit. So typically this is in that March or April time frame. And just a general tip for planting something that's been in storage for a period of time or it's been inside for a period of time, you want to try to plant those on a cloudy day or later in the day so that you eliminate a little bit of that shock of going from a dark area inside to a bright, sunny, hot area outside. You can try to transition those plants a little bit. And you'll notice in the image there, one important thing with strawberry plants is we want to make sure we have the proper planting depth. So the center of the plant, the growing point of the plant, you want at soil level. If you plant that crown or the growing area too high, it's going to dry out and the plant will die. If you plant it too deep, it's going to rot and the plant will also die. So you want that area right in the middle where the soil is just covering the top of the roots and the growing point, the crown of the plant is right above the soil surface. That's kind of our ideal planting position. Now, there is some management involved in growing those strawberries. So if you are growing those in the ground, there's a system that we call the matted row system. This is popular for the June bearings where you have that one big flush. You space your plants about 18 to 30 inches apart when you're planting them. If you're doing multiple rows, you have rows about 3 to 4 feet apart. And if you're familiar with strawberries, you know they put off a ton of runners or daughter plants that we call them. So they put off all these little side shoots of growth. So those daughter plants are allowed to just root wherever they want to, and you end up with this big mat of strawberry plants essentially, which is what the name matted row entails. Okay, so not a lot of management going on there besides just maintaining rows. Okay. Another option is what we call spaced row, and this has a similar spacing. So the plants, the mother plants, the initial plants are going to be similar, but you're going to space your daughter plants no closer than 4 inches apart. So that means what you're doing is you're coming in and you're cutting off all the other runners and only leaving the ones that are properly spaced apart, about 4 inches or so apart. What that's going to do is it's going to give you better air movement, better light penetration to those plants, and less competition. So you do tend to have a higher yield, bigger berries, fewer disease problems. But of course that takes labor and that takes time. So it just kind of depends how much time you have available and what your kind of ultimate goal is with those plants. There's also what we call the hill system, and this is simply where you're planting the mother plant and you're removing all of the runners. So you're letting all of the energy just go into that one mother plant, and you're taking off any of those runners that might take away from that energy that's going into the mother plant. Okay, and that's what you're going to do for the everbearings or day neutrals is what they recommend for those. I saw a question come through about pots. I didn't include pots in here, but we can definitely talk about that quick. Strawberries are great in containers, in raised beds. I tend to grow them a lot in raised beds just because it keeps them contained. I don't have to worry about those runners going out to different areas, and that works great. That's definitely doable. They'll overwinter just fine, especially in a larger pot. If you're going to plant them in a container and leave them outside for the winter, you just want to make sure you have a large enough pot that's going to have enough soil to kind of insulate those roots during the winter. Okay, if they're planted in a very small pot, you're probably going to want to bring them in the garage or in a cooler area for the winter and then take them back outside. Okay, but if it's a large enough container, you could leave those outside for the winter and just keep them growing. I've actually grown strawberries in a pallet as well. I've laid a pallet flat, filled it with soil, and planted in between the rows of the pallets. And that's worked well too. They're pretty shallow rooted plants, so they don't need a huge amount of soil area to grow. Okay, so hopefully that helps, and we can address that at the end too. Okay, next up, blueberries. Blueberries in the genus Vaccinium, and there are 3 types of blueberries in the U.S. You have low bush, which you're going to find natively growing in the northern U.S. High bush, which are what you're going to find available to grow in your garden. Those are the commercial varieties that you can find. And then in the southern U.S., growing natively, you'll find what we call rabbit eye blueberries. So we're looking at some high bush cultivars here. Again, here's our chart of recommended cultivars that again is going to have regions and some notes about them. So if it's an early cultivar, it's a late cultivar, large berries, small berries, those are some of the things you're going to look for blueberries. Okay, the requirements in particular for blueberries are going to be like all these: a full sun area, a well-drained soil, uniform moisture, but what's different here is an acidic soil. Okay, we need a pH of 4.8 to 5.2. So what you're going to do is get that soil test or use the pH test kit, find out what your soil pH is, and then you're going to have to add amendments based on that pH. So 2 ways that you can lower the pH of your soil is by, 1, adding sphagnum peat moss. So you can purchase sphagnum peat moss from garden centers. You incorporate that into the soil, so you mix it into the existing garden soil, and it has an immediate effect on lowering your pH somewhat. Okay, so that's more of an immediate action because you're mixing it right into the garden soil. The other option is to add elemental sulfur, and this again you can purchase at your garden center, and you're going to apply this to the soil, but it's going to be a slow reaction to lower the pH. So elemental sulfur is great when you're planting ahead. You know you're going to plant a plot of blueberries. What you're going to do is add the amount of elemental sulfur that's needed to lower your pH, and it's going to take about a year to get down to that desired pH. So it's not an immediate lowering like you have with sphagnum peat moss. It's going to take time to lower that pH. So you need to plan ahead a little bit on that. And the reason this is important, because what will happen is if the pH is not right, if you don't have that lower pH, iron is going to be unavailable to those plants in that pH range. And what you're going to have is the leaves are going to yellow, which is called chlorosis. And eventually the plant's going to die. It's going to slowly decline until it dies. So you might have a healthy blueberry plant to start with, might look good for a year or two, but unless that pH continues to be in that low range, that plant is not going to survive for the long term. So just take some prep work, some planning to get that soil pH changed. Now, a couple of other tips here on blueberry blossoms. Ideally, you want to plant 2 varieties of blueberry if you can, 2 different varieties, so that they can cross-pollinate each other. That's typically going to get you a better pollination rate and higher yield. So when you're looking at that chart and you want to plant some early blueberries, you want to select 2 different blueberry cultivars that flower at the same time, that are early flowers. That way they can cross-pollinate each other, and you're going to have a higher yield. Okay, you also want to remove the flowers during the 1st and 2nd years of growth. Okay, so you really are not going to get your full blueberry harvest until year 3, because year 1 and 2, we really want the plant to not take energy away towards flowers. We want it to focus on getting those roots established, getting a nice established plant, so that from years on, you're going to have very productive blueberry harvests. So years 1 and 2, remove those flowers. In terms of planting, you want to plant at the same depth the plant was growing in the pot or in the field. Spread the roots out evenly. Add your garden soil and sphagnum peat moss mixture back into the hole. Water thoroughly, and then apply mulch. Okay, I noted earlier that blueberries like a consistent moisture. So one thing you can do to help that is put mulch down, and that'll help maintain the soil moisture. They really like being mulched. The other thing we're going to do to maintain that acidic soil is to fertilize. Okay, so 4 weeks after planting, you're going to get ammonium sulfate fertilizer, again from the garden center, and you're going to apply 1 ounce of that in a band around the base of the plant. That's going to give you some nitrogen to the plants, but it's also an acidic fertilizer. So it's also going to maintain the acidity. So every year you're going to up that until you get to year 8 and you apply 8 ounces. And then every year you continue to apply 8 ounces. Okay, and the reason you need to do that is because even if you apply sphagnum peat moss, you do elemental sulfur that 1st year, if you do nothing else to maintain that low pH, it's going to creep back up again. Okay, so you need to be fertilizing on a yearly basis to maintain that lower pH. Otherwise, it's going to creep back up to its natural, probably 7 or 8 pH. Okay, so it's a little bit of maintenance work, but I think worth it because fresh blueberries are delicious. Excellent. You can also grow these in containers too. So if you don't want to go through the whole battle of changing the pH in a soil bed, a ground bed or a raised bed, try them in containers to start with. Okay, like I said, you can easily add peat moss Most potting mix you're going to use anyways already has peat moss in it. So you can easily adjust pH in a container and try to grow those plants that way as well. Definitely worth trying. Okay, next up, we have the brambles. So I mentioned brambles and the rubus species. We're going to start with raspberries here. Raspberries can either be red varieties, black, purple, or yellow. Those are all different types of raspberries that we can get. And you'll notice here again, we've got a chart of common cultivars that you can get, their harvest season, where they're adapted to, and then some notes on particular varieties. So you've got some red options, some yellow, some black, and purple to take a look at. Black raspberries, if you ever need to distinguish between a raspberry and a blackberry, which we're going to talk about next, a raspberry, when you pull it off of the plant, the receptacle or the bottom of the fruit stays on the plant. So you're left with this hollow centered fruit. So if you've ever eaten a raspberry, you've seen that. So if you see these at a farmer's market and you're like, oh, these are dark, they look like a blackberry, look for that center. If it has an open center, if it's empty in the middle, it's a raspberry. Okay, if it doesn't, if it's solid piece of fruit, then you're looking at a blackberry. Okay, just an easy way to tell. So that was black. Here's our common red raspberries. Purple is a cross between red and black. And then lastly, you have your yellow or your golden varieties. Okay, so lots to choose from. What you're planting with raspberries, typically you're ordering or you're buying a 1-year-old plant. Okay, again, brambles in particular are susceptible to virus. So we want to make sure we're starting with quality, healthy plants to start with. We're going to plant them in the spring, water them well to get started. And then if it's a typical propagated raspberry, we're going to cut it back at planting, leaving about 10 to 12 inches. So we're going to give it an initial pruning and leave about 10 to 12. If it's a tissue culture plant, the branching tends to be a little bit different on those, so we don't prune those back. Okay, so just slightly different on the type of plant. When you're growing any of the rubus species, you're typically growing them in rows, either hills or hedgerows. One, partly because that's how they naturally tend to grow. Red and yellow raspberries put out root suckers. So if I planted, let's say 5 raspberry plants and I spaced them, let's say 4 feet apart in a row, okay, eventually what's going to happen is that I'm going to have a solid row of raspberries because it's going to produce root suckers that are going to come up every year, and I'm going to form basically a big mass of raspberries, okay, a hedgerow essentially. If I planted the same thing with black or purple varieties, I would not have that because black and purple do not produce the root suckers like red and yellow do. I would have still 4 or 5 individual plants, whatever I planted. So keep that in mind when you're planting them, what variety you have, and if it's going to produce root suckers and fill out an area. Okay, it can be a little bit aggressive, so you have to keep that in mind when you are planting those. Mulch is going to be especially helpful here as well. This is a project one of my previous colleagues did as a research project. She was researching different types of mulch for brambles in particular. So you can see on the left, she used a bark mulch mixture, a straw mulch mixture, fabric, landscape fabric, cultivation, hand weeding, and then lastly, the control, which means no weeding. So obviously you can see, you can't even see where the raspberry plants are. There's so many weeds. So mulching is going to be very helpful for weed control in particular, but also as well for keeping the soil moisture consistent. All good things. Now, your biggest decision with the brambles is what season you're going to have those fruits, okay? Because similar to what we were talking earlier with strawberries, there's two different types of timings here. You have your summer bearing raspberries, okay? And what's going to happen here is you're going to have one crop of berries that are going to be produced on the 2-year-old stems or the canes. So when a stem emerges from the ground, when a cane emerges, in that first year, it's a 1-year-old cane. When it overwinters and it starts to grow the second year, it's now a 2-year-old cane. And those are the canes that are going to produce the flowers and the fruit. Okay, so summer bearing, you're typically going to find purple and black raspberries are going to be all summer bearing. But reds and yellows can either be this option where they're summer bearing, or you can choose some ever bearing varieties. And the difference here is that you're going to have 2 crops of fruit at 2 different times of the year. So that first crop is going to flower and fruit on the tips of the 1-year-old canes in the fall. So a cane starts to grow in the spring, it grows all summer. In the fall, that cane is going to flower on the tip, and you're going to have a small amount of fruit produced in the fall. Okay, then that cane is going to overwinter, and it's going to start to grow the second year, and it's going to flower and fruit again farther down the cane. So on this one cane, you had a harvest in the fall at the tip, and then you had another harvest in the summer the next year later down. So instead of having all of your fruit in the summer, you also have this secondary crop in the fall, which is, again, nice because you have different harvests at different times. But obviously that makes management a little bit different, which we'll talk about later in the management section. Next up, blackberries are going to grow very similar. Okay, you have a couple different growth types with blackberries. You can have a blackberry plant that's very erect, meaning it can stand on its own. It doesn't need trellising. It's a very strong plant. You have what we call semi-erect blackberries, meaning that they're a little bit upright, but they could still use some trellising. And then you have fully trailing blackberries that need a trellis system. They need to grow on something. Otherwise, they're just going to be laying on the ground. Then you get to pick if your cultivar is going to be thorny, it's going to have thorns on it, or if it's going to be thornless. Okay, so here you have a chart of some blackberry cultivars recommended for Illinois. So you've got some thornless options there, and you've got some thorny options. Now, pay attention to the region of adaptation there. You'll notice with the thornless chart, only one of them is recommended for central Illinois, the rest for southern Illinois. And even on the thorny list here, there's only one that's recommended for northern Illinois. Blackberries tend to struggle being winter hardy, and especially the thornless cultivars. If I planted a thornless cultivar in northern Illinois, unless I provided some extra winter protection, it's probably going to be difficult for it to survive the winter. They're just not as winter hardy as some of the thorny cultivars. So you have to keep that in mind. So Illini hardy, like I mentioned, is one of those erect thorny cultivars that we recommend. It's winter hardy. It has large flavorful fruit. It does have thorns, of course, but that just comes along with the territory on those. Okay. You also, like I said, can have, if you live farther south, you can grow some of those thornless types that tend to be more semi-erect, where you don't have the thorns. They have large fruit. They produce a little bit later, but they're less hardy. Okay. Now, in terms of planting, it's going to be very similar to the raspberries. You're going to plant them in the early spring, start with high quality virus-free plants. And this time you're going to cut them back to about 6 inches if it's a conventional plant, or again, tissue culture, just plant it and let it go. Otherwise, it's going to be similar cultivation, similar mulching, similar care to raspberries. Okay, all very, very similar there. So with that, that will be kind of the intro to our berries here. You're going to hear a lot more later about management in terms of how to prune those different types, things like that. That's coming. So a couple of resources we'll share. The Midwest Small Fruit Pest Management Handbook is great if you're needing help with pests, diseases, weeds, all of that. The Small Fruit and Grape Spray Guide is going to be a little bit more commercial grower focused in terms of what you can apply for pesticides if you do have pest or disease problems, but that's a great resource. And then we also have websites on these fruits as well. So we have a strawberry website, we have a raspberry website, and then we have a general fruit website. So if it was hard to see those charts that I shared from our Master Gardener manuals, those charts are also available on those websites as well. So you can always go there to read a little bit more about each of those. Okay, with that, I'm going to go back to the chat box. And I know we've got some questions that have come in here.
And Candice, I've got them ready for you if you want me to
Perfect.
read them to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So our first question was, are there any of the berries originally native to the U.S. or this region?
So in terms of strawberries, yeah, they're definitely native. You can find them growing natively in Illinois, but they tend to be much smaller fruit. So the commercial varieties that we're talking about, no, have probably been bred to have bigger fruits and things like that, so they're not specifically native. Blueberries that we talked about, like I mentioned, those are high bush cultivars, so those are not going to be native, but we do have low bush blueberries that can be native. And brambles, absolutely. There's lots of wild brambles that you'll find growing in Illinois.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Next question. I like this question. Why would somebody want June bearing when they could get ever bearing or day neutral and get berries all season long?
I know, that's a great question, right? Honestly, if it was me, what I would do is I would plant some of those June berries because your June bearing crop is going to have the highest yield. Okay, you're going to have typically the best yield from that June bearing because it comes all at once. The weather conditions are typically perfect that time of year, so you tend to have a higher yield, and that's why someone might do the June bearings. But if it was me in my garden, I would plant some June bearings so that I would have that crop, but then I would also plant some of the day neutrals so that I could have it other times of the year too. That's what I would do. I would do both so that you have all of that season.
Awesome. And I would do the exact same thing as well.
Yeah.
Um, Next question. What soil is considered too wet? During April, the soil is usually wetter than later in the year.
Yeah, and that's a hard one to measure. Basically, if you go and try to dig a hole and it's sopping wet, there's water still standing in that area, or in my case, most of my soil is heavy clay. So if I try to dig in an area and I dig up and it's just big clumps of wet soil that's sticking together, that may not be your ideal time for planting. Because what'll happen is that you'll kind of compact things then when you go to put that soil back in. So really there's not an exact measure for that. You just don't want a sopping wet soil that's sticking together in big clumps because you can damage your soil structure when you try to plant or work in the soil when it's like that.
All right.
So hopefully that makes sense.
How wide should the matted row be for strawberries?
That's kind of personal preference. I basically you want to be able to reach in from each side to be able to harvest. So I would say 3, probably 4 feet maximum as a width so that you could stand on each side and harvest. And then if you're doing multiple rows, you'd probably want at least a foot or so in between so that for a row so that you can walk in between.
Okay. Next question, well, next 2 questions are about runners.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is, when do you remove the runners?
Mm-hmm.
And then the follow-up is, do you remove all the runners when you are growing in a flower pot type container?
So kind of that flower, I'll do the flower pot question first. It depends what type you're growing. If you're growing day neutrals in a container, then yep, I would remove all the runners and just let that mother plant produce all of the fruits. But if you're growing a June bearing in a container, then I would go ahead and let those runners go. Because in a container, the runners are just going to kind of hang off the side, and you might have some fruit produced on those as well. So you could go ahead and leave them. Okay. And then first one was when to remove them, right?
Yes.
So ideally, as early as possible. So like once you start to see those runners being produced, go ahead and clip them off. If you don't get to them right away and they get rooted into the ground, that's okay too. You can still pull them out and remove them at that point. But the idea is that you don't want that mother plant to expend the energy. So the earlier you can see them, the earlier you can cut them off, the least amount of energy that mother plant is going to expend on them. Hopefully that makes sense.
Mhm. All right, this was one that came in. I have always been told to use straw between the rows and around strawberry plants. Then I heard about using wood chips. I believe it was hickory that was suggested. What kind would you recommend? At least the wood chips would not sprout like the straw would.
That's a good question. And honestly, I think either is fine. Straw is definitely the most common that people use. I think mostly because you can put it in a thin enough layer that the plants can easily come through it in the spring. And if you're getting a good quality straw, typically you're not getting too many weed seeds in it, but it just kind of depends on the quality of your straw. You can use wood chips, but you'd have to be careful about how thick you place those wood chips over the plants in particular, because if you get too thick of a layer of wood chips, the plants may struggle to come up through that. You could apply it thicker in the walking areas, and then do it a little bit cleaner, thinner over the planting area. But yeah, wood chips I think would be fine. Any type of organic mulch that's going to break down over time would be usable, I would say.
Okay. I think the other thing that I might just add
Please.
is with the wood chips, you want to be concerned about how big the wood chips are
Yeah.
because they would have a tendency to hold more water,
Mm-hmm.
and that might, particularly with strawberries, lead to more fungal issues.
True. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So you'd want a finer bark mixture if you could.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. This one was about overwintering strawberries in the garage. If you keep strawberries in a pot and then overwinter in the garage, do you water them? If so, how much?
So honestly, no, you shouldn't really need to apply any water until it becomes probably March when you're starting to think about bringing it back out. Because essentially what you're wanting to do is just let the plant go dormant in that pot. So it'll have some initial moisture when you bring it in, and then you're just kind of letting that pot sit there, let the plant go dormant. And then once it gets closer to spring, you can start to slowly add some water and kind of coax those plants out of dormancy. That's what I've done in times when I've tried it, bringing them in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And remember back, if you were with us last week when we talked about container fruits, we still, even if we're overwintering in the garage, we have to make sure that we're getting those 32 to 45-degree temperatures
Yeah.
so that we initiate that flowering.
Yep. Good point. Yeah. And that's why the garage is nice, because it's typically cool enough, or a basement if you have a cool enough basement. Yeah.
All right. We had a couple of questions on pH, but then you addressed those for blueberries. How long do you produce? How long do strawberries produce? Um, how many years would they last?
So if I remember our chart in our master gardener manual, for example, we have a whole chart on life of the plants, and what's listed for a strawberry plant, I believe, is like 1 to 3 years. So the actual mother plant is going to be the most productive in those first couple of years, and then after that the yield will start to decline. So typically what you want to do is kind of renovate a strawberry bed every once in a while, where you're coming in and you're um, removing probably that older mother plant and letting the daughter plants become that new growth to take over. So in terms of highest yield, it's typically a fairly short life if you go by research measures.
All right. But it is the plant that keeps renewing itself. So in that
Exactly. Yeah.
sense, you get
It's
long
always
lived.
yeah, it's always putting on new growth. So you always have this kind of renewal of new plants, which is fun and cool. Yeah.
All right. We're switching it up to blueberries now.
Yeah.
Removing flowers from blueberry plants after you've transplanted. Um, Are you doing this for 2 years or are you doing it for 1?
2 years. So that first year that you plant, you want to remove the flowers, and then the next year you want to remove the flowers, and that third year you can leave those flowers and let those blueberries come on. That's going to be ideal for root growth and getting established.
Okay. And this next question, I'm kind of interested in your answer.
Mhm.
What about blueberries in hanging containers? Are they worth it?
You know, I have never tried those. Have you ever tried those?
I haven't tried them in hanging containers. Some of the newer cultivars that are bred for containers, um, I think would have a better chance of surviving than if we put an
Mhm.
in-ground variety.
Mhm. Yeah, yes, I've never tried them, so I can't speak exactly to that. I don't know. I think they would do well probably for a short period of time, maybe a couple of years. And again, you'd have to bring them inside, you'd have to give them that cold treatment and then take them back out. So to me, it would be a lot of work to maintain it. But that's just what I'm thinking. It's worth a shot if they're, I think, but I can't speak to it because I've never tried them. Yeah.
I think one thing that I kind of like about the concept is because blueberries hate wet feet and
Hmm.
having that wet soil, there'd be a good amount of drainage for
It's
those.
true. Yeah, you could really monitor your watering really easily. Yeah, that is true. Good point.
All right. If you have an established blueberry plant but never added ammonium sulfate, how much do you start with?
That is an excellent question. So what you would do is you would get a soil test in that area where you have your blueberries planted. And I thought I had a chart in here, but I didn't have it in this presentation. And I'll find a link and add it once Bruce starts. But there's a chart that will tell you. So if your pH, let's say you get that soil test back and your pH is 7, okay, this chart is going to tell you how many pounds of either elemental sulfur or fertilizer to add to start to lower that pH. So there are charts that you can follow. So I'll try to find that link and add it once you get started.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next one is a raspberry question.
Okay.
Can you mulch with shredded leaves?
For sure. Yeah. That's a great mulch material. Yeah. Ideally, and like you said, they should be shredded so it doesn't kind of mat together like solid big leaves would do. But yeah, that's a great mulch material.
And the only thing that I would add is just make sure that the leaves don't have any disease
Hmm.
issues with them so
Yeah,
that they don't
absolutely.
transfer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to
Good
make
points.
Grant's presentation very valuable next
Yeah,
week.
diseases.
Best time to transplant raspberries and blackberries.
I would say probably if it was me, I would probably do it in the fall. So after I've harvested that fall crop on off of them, or after that summer crop, I would probably do it at that point so that you can, so like August, September, dig them up, get as much root system as you can, move them to the new site, and water them well that initial fall to get them established. That way, next spring, they should be off to a fairly good start. You can have new canes being produced that next spring. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't do it now, this spring. You just might not have a crop this year, which is fine. It's not the end of the world. You might just delay that a little bit.
Okay.
That's what I would do.
Um, can you touch on growing blueberries in a raised bed?
Oh yeah, I would. If I was going to grow blueberries, I don't grow any in my garden right now. But if I was going to, I would do them in a raised bed because that would make the soil amendment a little bit easier. So that way, I could either start with a brand new raised bed, bring in garden soil, and then easily incorporate the peat moss and the elemental sulfur. To me, that's a lot easier to do in a raised bed than it is in a ground bed where you need a tiller and it can be a little bit more complicated. So, yep, absolutely. You can grow them in a raised bed. Ideally, any raised bed, you want at least a 6 to 8 inch depth. So you want it at least 6 to 8 inches high. Otherwise, yeah, for sure, raised beds would be great.
Okay. And the next question, I don't want to steal Grant's thunder for next week, but
Yeah.
since you opened the door, how do you know when you have verticillium wilt? What
Yeah,
does it look like?
I'll touch on it quick, and then yeah, Grant, I'm sure will elaborate in his presentation. So essentially, it's a wilt disease. So when a plant has verticillium wilt, it's gonna be wilted. Parts of the plant will start to wilt. And the way that you can check for sure is to take a look at the water conducting tissue. So if you cut a stem on a plant that you think might have verticillium wilt, you cut that stem, you cut it on an angle. In a lot of plants, you can actually see a ring of discoloration where the water conducting tissue is. So this maple tree, for example, on my front yard, when it was actively growing and I suspected verticillium wilt, I could cut a stem, cut it at an angle, and I could actually see that discoloration happening. Always good idea to send it to our plant clinic to get it tested so that you know for sure. But that's one way that you can kind of suspect that it's verticillium wilt.
Okay. Are the small strawberries on the ground type strawberry edible?
Yeah, in terms of like safety, I'll check the research for sure, but I'm fairly certain that those are edible. They tend to be very small, so in terms of like growing them for the strawberries, it's probably not your best choice, but as a ground cover, they're lovely. And yes, I am fairly certain they are edible as well.
Okay. This one is a question that is right up your alley.
Oh yeah.
How do you become a master gardener?
Excellent question. So a couple ways to do that. We have face-to-face trainings where you can attend a training in person at an extension office typically, or we also have an online training program where you can take a course online at home at your own pace on a computer. So either way, what you'll want to do is reach out to your local extension office. So you can find that on our extension webpage, find what county you live in, and reach out to them, and they will let you know when the next in-person training is or when the next online training is being offered. But yeah, we'd love to have you become a master gardener. Great question.
And just a local plug that my unit for Carroll-Lee-Whiteside County is planning a fall training if everything goes well. So
Awesome.
if you're in my county, give me a call.
Sweet.
This one is a question about yield. How many plants or bushes do I need to amount to something? In other words, to feed a local family.
And you
How
know
many?
what? I don't remember that off the top of my head, honestly. Let me see. Like I said, we have a chart of that in our Master Gardener Manual that lays it out very nicely, and I just don't have it in front of me. So if you want to, you can send me an email, and I'll see if I can find that chart for you, because it has it outlined, kind of what the yield is and how many you might recommend. I think for a family of 5 is what it has on there. So shoot me an email, and I'll find that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this question was about the brambles. How wide should the hedgerow be?
Oh gosh. I would say again, it's kind of how deep you can get into harvest. So I would say probably a 3 to 4 foot hedgerow of raspberry would be fairly ideal. Now, keep in mind those root suckers, they have a mind of their own. So you're going to have to maintain whatever size hedgerow you want. So you're either going to need to mow the area on either side of the hedgerow, or you're going to need to come in frequently and remove those root suckers in order to maintain that. But yeah, I would say ideally probably a 4 foot row so that you could harvest from either side and be able to reach those berries pretty easily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Back to the mulch question. Can composted manure be used as a mulch?
Yeah, absolutely. That you want to make sure it is well composted and it's aged manure, because if you're putting anything fresh on there, it can be too high in nutrients and you can burn your plants, and it can also be, from a food safety standpoint, not ideal. But yes, you can use composted aged manure and add that to the top of the bed to be used as a organic matter and also as a mulch material.
Okay. Are there strategies to keep soil from falling out of the openings of a terracotta strawberry pot?
You know, not really. What you could do is you could line that pot, let's say, with newspaper or paper, some type of thin material. So before you fill the pot with potting mix, put a layer of kind of newspaper in there, and then fill your potting soil in there. And then what you could do is kind of just punch holes on each side through the newspaper and plug your plant in that way. That would be, for me, kind of a short-term solution to start with. But once the roots are established from those strawberries, you shouldn't have a problem. It's just that initial planting. That's what I would do.
Okay. Next question is, how long will raspberries last? We've had ours for about 20 years. Should we completely start over?
That's kind of up to you. If you feel like they're still producing well and they're healthy, they don't have any virus symptoms, or they're disease free, they're doing well, and you're pruning properly, I think you're totally fine. Because the thing about raspberries is that those canes only live for 2 years. So every year you're having this cycle of new canes being produced and the old ones dying off. So you're always having, kind of like the strawberries, you're always having new growth coming on. So if your hedgerow is healthy, if your plants are healthy, they're producing well, I think you're fine to continue on. You could also propagate, so you could dig up some of those root suckers or take cuttings and propagate those plants and replant in a new area if you feel like you do need to refresh the planting. But if they're producing well and they're healthy, you don't need to necessarily.
Okay. We touched on this next one about removing the flowers on blueberries. Would you recommend it for the container blueberries as well?
You know, I probably would that first year for sure. But since you have a smaller rooting area, those roots are probably going to establish a little faster in a container because you don't have as much soil and it's softer soil. It's probably easier to grow roots. So I might not do it the second year, and let them go on. They've been bred. If you're putting a one in a container, you're typically getting a cultivar that's been bred for container growth. So pay attention to what the tag says too on the particular variety you're buying, because it may differ by variety. But I would say do it that first year, but you may not have to that second year.
All right.
Yeah.
There are 2 questions here that I think I cover in management, so I will
Perfect.
save
Oh
those.
yeah, pruning. Yep.
And the last one that I've got from the chat box is, can you grow blueberries in partial shade?
You know, you can. Like, the plant will grow, it will survive, but your yield is likely going to be lower. Okay, you're going to have the best flower production in full sun. In part shade, you're not going to get as many flowers, which means you're not going to have as much yield. So it just kind of depends how important a high yield is to you.
All right.
Yep. Okay. Did we get them all?
Oh, there was one more. Can you plant raspberries on the side of your house in part shade?
Oh yeah, same thing. Yep, you can, but like I said, they're not going to be as strong and as thriving as they would in full sun. Yeah.
All right.
And then was there one about pine needles?
Yes.
Oh yeah, and slides. And you emailed the handout.
Yep.
Right.
So handouts should have been emailed depending on when you registered. If you've pre-registered, you got them last night. If you registered just this morning, it would have went to your email about 10 o'clock.
Perfect. And then pine needles for mulch. You can certainly use the pine needles as mulch. They make a great mulch material, but you would still want to get a soil test, and you would probably still need to add amendments because it does acidify the soil slightly, but not enough to make a drastic amount. So still get a soil test, and you'll probably still have to do some amendments, but you can still use it as a mulch for sure. And then I see, where can we get a soil test? Excellent question. So right now, typically we have soil test kits at most of our extension offices, where we have a bag and a soil lab that you can send it off to. Obviously, right now our offices are closed for the time being, so I will grab a link for you. We have a list of soil test labs that we can send you, and you can just go to their website, give them a call, and they will tell you how to collect the sample and where to send it to. So I'll grab that link here next.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you, Candice.
Yeah, thank you guys. Great questions. Appreciate it.
All right. So if there's no more questions for Candice at this time, I'm going to go ahead and transition to the next part of our presentation today. And so full disclosure for you guys, when Candice, Grant, and I do this presentation, we normally do it over a 3-hour period. And what we decided was that we would do 2 hour-and-a-half presentations. And so I'm going to do half the presentation today, and then I will do the other half next week before Grant does his presentation on diseases. So one thing I want to make sure that we do, just to kind of break it up again, Candice had one more poll that she wanted us to do. So I will go ahead and launch that poll.
Oh,
and
thanks.
This is a review question.
Forgot about that.
To see if you guys remember way back to the beginning. So the question is, which of the following fruits discussed today is a true botanical berry?
See how their botany knowledge is.
See if we've made any more plant nerds to join the club.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got about 40% of people responding, and there is a clear winner so far.
So far, going back and forth. Okay, I would say you guys got it. Blueberries is the right answer. That's the true berry. The rest of them are aggregate fruits or berry-like fruits. So good job.
And AJ, don't worry about it. It's anonymous, so we won't know.
Nope.
All right, so
thanks,
you guys can see the results on your screen right now. And I will stop sharing those. And we'll have one more question when we wrap up today. Or I might save it for next week when I get through management. We'll see. So we're going to talk about management, and very similar to Candice's presentation, we're going to do it by plant, just because that is the easiest way to give out the information. And I'm going to cover pruning and training, irrigation or watering, fertilizing, some maintenance tips or things we have to do to maintain the plant, how to harvest it, and then since I'm a plant nerd just like Candice, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of post-harvest information. Just because you work so hard to grow your own fresh produce, you want to know how long it's going to last and the best conditions to keep it the longest you can. So I'm going to go ahead and start out with strawberries. And I love this picture. I'm just going to give you a side note because they're growing in a gutter that they've turned into a hydroponic chamber or growing apparatus for their backyard. So I just love this picture. For our strawberries, Candice kind of touched on the palette, which I was glad she did, because it's one of those things that has been popping up on crafting websites and hobbyist websites as a new way to garden. So this is a pallet garden here that they laid flat. They wrapped the bottom with landscape fabric, and then they filled it with soil and planted the strawberries in there. With this one and our pyramid gardens down here at the bottom, all of these are going to need a little bit of winter protection. So for the pallet garden, if you're going to move this inside of your garage, you still need to keep those temperatures between 32 and 45 degrees to initiate flowering for the next year. For the pallet gardens down here, these you would just cover with straw mulch or whatever kind of mulch you had. Last week when we talked about container fruits, we talked about wrapping our pots with blankets, quilts, bubble wrap, the companies that make the floating row covers, they make a heavy duty insulating cover. That is an option here to use as well. I always include this picture down here at the bottom left because ideally this is a beautiful picture to have a pyramid of strawberry plants with a watering fountain coming out of the middle. But it's a teachable moment because that picture screams fungal site to me. With the water being applied to the leaves, it's going to create a lot of fungal issues affecting the plant's growth, as well as affecting the post-harvest life of your produce. All right, so for irrigation, you're gonna need about 1 inch of water a week for your strawberries. During periods of intense heat or drought, this might be increased, so you're out there watering a little bit more frequently. You can use a drip irrigation system if you to more precisely water your plants. And so I'm not sure if my pointer's showing up, so let me try this. The gray pipes that are running through the rows here, these are rubber piping that runs down the row, and each of these purple squares is an emitter that drips water right at the soil level. And so since you're applying the water directly to the soil and not getting any on the leaves or the plant, it cuts down on your disease issues. Like many of you, I do a lot of hand watering for my strawberries. And so I'm going to give you a couple of tips to prevent some of those issues. One of the great investments that I purchased recently was the watering wands, the long-handled ones, because since I don't have a drip system set up, I can put that wand in between the rows and water down the rows right at the soil line without getting the foliage too wet. Watering early will also help your plants survive some of the stresses during the day. watering late afternoon is okay, but you don't want to water at night because the plants aren't taking that water up. When they're not actively photosynthesizing, the plants aren't pulling water in. And so if you water at night, you're actually just saturating the soil, and then the plants sit in that water overnight. To help cut down on your watering needs, Candice touched on this a bit about adding mulch. It helps to suppress some weeds as well as helps holding in that water. Fertilizing, for our June bearing strawberries, you're gonna wanna add compost or organic fertilizer. And for June bearing, if you don't see runners being produced by mid-July, you'll want to add that compost in there. Usually if the strawberries are not starting to produce the runners after they've fruited, what that means is when June bearing strawberries take all of the nutrients that it can pull out of the soil, that it can take from the rest of the plant. It's put all of those nutrients and sugars into producing those strawberries that you harvest in June, and then it doesn't have enough nutrients left or can't take up enough nutrients to continue its life cycle. Before plants begin their growth in the spring of year 2, this is for ever-bearing and June-bearing strawberries, you want to add some compost or some organic nitrogen as part of your yearly maintenance schedule. One thing that since it was mentioned about manure, make sure that it is composted, as Candice recommended. And then I always recommend applying your composted manure 4 to 6 months prior to harvest, especially if it's not completely aged. And this helps to cut down on those food sanitation issues. So this 6-month marker, if you are going to be planting June bearing strawberries, those can start developing or be ready to harvest the end of May through the 4th of July, depending on your cultivar. So I don't know many people that will be outside applying manure in December, but this is something that you could apply at the end of your season as well to break down through the winter. For maintenance, as Candice mentioned, you want to remove the flowers upon planting, and that's for 6 weeks. So for the first 6 weeks after you've planted, you'll remove those flowers. And for the ever-bearing or day-neutral strawberries, after those 6 weeks, you can leave those flowers on there, and you may get a small crop later that year. Depending on what system you've planted, you're going to thin your strawberries either using the hill system, you're going to cut the runners off as they appear, and the matted row system, you're going to remove the surplus daughter plants that are outside your row length. So as Candice mentioned, with your matted row, if you're keeping it between 3 to 4 feet wide, if you have daughter plants that have expanded your row to 5 or 6 feet, you're going to remove those plants. What's great about removing those daughter plants is you can use those to start another strawberry patch, or if they're healthy and you're part of a gardening group or have friends who want to grow strawberries, you can give them those plants to start their own strawberry garden. And then for our maintenance, for winter care or winter cover, we want to apply 4 to 6 inches of straw or weed-free mulch to help insulate those strawberries. Now, usually we can count on snow to help insulate because it is an excellent insulator. But since we haven't had as much snow as we normally do, we want to think about adding a little bit more straw mulch, closer to that 6 inches, to help get through the winter. One thing just to reiterate, if you are growing these berries in containers, you do still want to wrap your containers with the materials we covered last week of the insulated row cover, the blankets, the bubble wrap, and then apply that mulch on top just to make sure we're providing enough heat or warmth to protect those roots. Because I'm one of those graphic type people, I found this chart from another extension source, and it was the University of Minnesota extension. And I like that this lays it out in calendar format, so I know what I have to do during which month. And the plant dormant plants, plant potted transplants, and pinching of flower buds off of the transplants, those are things that you'll do in the first year. So if you are working on year 2, then you will start with thinning your June-bearing plants within 2 weeks of harvest and doing the rest of these on a yearly cycle. All right, I'm going to see if we can get through strawberries for today's presentation. For weed control, many of the steps that Candice mentioned during the planning stage is going to pay off for your weeds control. Starting with a disease and weed-free site, using proper mulch, as in weed-free mulches, plastic mulches, weed-free organic mulches, all will help. Since our strawberries are perennial plants, you want to make sure that you are taking those weeds out as they develop so that they're not competing with those weeds for those nutrients. Weed ID is always going to be beneficial. So knowing what stage of the growth the weed is in is going to help you best identify when that weed is most vulnerable for you to apply a pesticide, or if you're doing it organically, what's the easiest time to cultivate those weeds out of there. Weed control for annuals is best to do before planting, and for perennials, a fall application is going to be best. To harvest your strawberries, you want to do that on the coolest part of the day, so early morning or afternoon or evening. One major thing is don't harvest when the plants are wet, and this is going to be for disease issues. If one plant has a fungal issue or has fungal spores on them, those can transfer from the berries or from your hands or your shoes, as you walk through the garden, you're going to be spreading those spores around, and when they come in contact with the water, they're going to become more active. Harvest them when they are uniformly red, firm, and full flavored. Um, and always use a 2-bucket system. Have one for your bad berries and one for your good berries, so that you're eliminating some of the insect issues as well. Grant will talk about those next week with his. If you're doing this for a farmer's market, or you're going to do this as a side job, a lot of the training of your pickers is going to be important. Grading, sizing, and packaging for strawberries is done during the while you're in the field. And since strawberries are very delicate and easily damaged, you want to make sure that you're putting good training into those that are going to be handling your fruit. One thing to note about strawberries is that the sugar content does not increase after harvest. So when you harvest that, if you harvest that strawberry too early, it's not going to be as sweet as if you harvest it the day that it's perfect. So that is one thing that really attracts people to growing their own strawberries, is I can get the sweetest strawberry possible as compared to those that might be in my local garden center or grocery store. Sorry. All right, one more slide, and then I realize we're at time, but this is the post-harvest. So this is the part where it really matters for the homeowner. These are extremely perishable. If you leave them out at room temperature, they are going to expire faster than if they are refrigerated. Now, the store at 32 degrees and 90% relative humidity is the ideal perfect temperature to get your strawberries to last 7 days, last their longest possible. This isn't always going to be ideal because we have refrigerators and we have multiple types of produce in our fridge, but putting them in the crisper drawer and setting them to control for humidity is going to help prolong that life. Just as an example, the shelf life for a strawberry, if it is put in a refrigerated section at 37 degrees, it can last up to 7 days. But if you leave it in a warmer environment, which is only 4 degrees warmer, you're losing 2 days worth of shelf life. Now, when you picture summer temperatures, it's 60, 70, 80 degrees outside, and if your house isn't air conditioned, your berries will only last maybe a day or two. All right, so since we're at time for today, I'm going to stop here and we will talk about blueberries and brambles management next week when we reconvene for part 2 of berry school.
You've got some questions, Bruce. You want me to read those to you?
Yes, please.
Okay, back to, you're talking about pallets. Could you use, move my mic around. Could you use an insulating cover on a pallet?
Yes, so you can use an insulating cover on a pallet. It would actually provide good winter heat for those berries. And when you're doing a pallet, you actually want to increase the amount of, if you're doing an organic mulch, increase that to about 8 inches just to provide more insulation. But if you're using something designed to insulate that heat, then that would work.
Okay, and then follow-up question on pellets. Do you need to know the history of the pellet before using for strawberries? Are there toxicity concerns?
Yes, so that is a great question. And you do want to use a pellet that was not chemically treated. The chemical that they use to treat those pellets is not food safe, and it will leach into the soil, which could then be picked up by the strawberries that you're eating. So knowing the history of the palate will help. There's a local palate place here in Whiteside County that actually does have that history of organic or non-treated versus cedar pallets.
Excellent. And I can't remember if we talk about birds or not, but a question about, are birds a problem for strawberries?
I believe Grant does, but
Okay,
yes,
that's what I was
they
thinking.
will be.
Okay, yeah, stay tuned for that. If your bed is surrounded by grass, how do you keep the grass out of your bed?
I have a lot of experience with this. One thing, making sure that the grass does not get tall enough to go to seed will help. If you are worried about some grass seed that could be in there, you can apply a pre-emergent to help cut down on those weed seeds. You can also, if you're worried about the grass spreading under the soil, you can try putting some barriers along the strawberry patch. Otherwise, a good mulch along the edges can also help.
Okay, very good. And this might be a good Grant question. What are the specific food safety concerns with using horse manure compost? And then she's in parentheses, if it's not completely aged, possibly salmonella, E. coli, etc.
And Grant, I do see you're on. You want to take this one? I'm putting him on the spot.
That.
If he's listening.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, I mean, there can be some concern with the salmonella, or rather with the E. coli levels of horse manure. You know, anything where it is raw manure application, you know, typically we're still recommend the fall. Sometimes you can also find an imbalance of your nitrogen cycles with the application of raw manure. So we still strongly recommend fall application if you can. Is kind of what you're after. And yet again, it's E. coli and some other issues. Horse manure also has a number of weed seeds in it that do not tend to get killed when they're added to the soil as well.
Great, thanks, Grant. Okay, and then you kind of talked about this a little bit. How do you control weeds that have invaded your existing strawberry bed? And then secondary, what's the difference in fruit quality when harvesting at midday versus afternoon, evening?
Okay, so for the weed question, that was existing weeds, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Existing, well, weeds that have invaded an existing strawberry bed.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to pull those out as quickly as you can because you don't want them to establish. But I do know from working in my own strawberry patch, it does become a mat, and that can sometimes be a challenge. You can apply chemicals, pesticides for organic and non-organic options if that is something that you are looking to do. Otherwise, using your more cultural or mechanical practices of hand weeding, hand pulling, hoeing, and this can be a great activity to pull in grandkids or children, just teaching them which ones to pull.
Awesome.
And then the other question was about berry quality.
Yeah, fruit quality, difference in fruit quality when harvesting at midday versus afternoon, evening.
Okay, so the difference for fruit quality is going to have to relate to temperature. So if you're harvesting at either early morning or late afternoon, early evening, it's going to be a cooler environment for those berries. They're not going to be as hot. If you harvest during the midday hour or 2 o'clock for our region, that is going to be the hottest time in the day. Those berries are going to be that environmental temperature. And so when you take them and put them in the refrigerator to cool them down, you're going to lose some of that quality because you're taking a berry that's 60 degrees and trying to get it down to 40.
Okay, very good. And then lastly, a question from a master gardener. How do we register for part 2? The master coordinator gave me the link, but she didn't see anything for part 2.
Okay.
Where do you want
So part 2, if you go to our extension website for Carroll-Lee and Whiteside County, that registration link for growing horticulture in Northwest Illinois, and I'm trying to do it as I talk. So we'll see if I can walk and chew gum at the same time.
It's always hard to do.
Will give you the ability to log in and register for next week. And so here is that link.
And Lisa asked, can you email the link to them?
Yes.
Can you email the existing registration list maybe?
Yeah, I can email that link. If you signed up for any of the presentations, even if you just signed up for how to kill your tomatoes that first week, you are in my email blast. And so you will get the registration information, as well as if you got the link for today's presentation, that link does not change. I've used the same email link. The only thing that did change, because we had some issues with phone registration, people joining by phone because the password had words and numbers in it, I changed that to a numerical password. But if you use the same link that you used today, that will get you into next week.
Perfect. I think that is all then.
All right. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I do apologize for going a little over on our time today. We will be back next week to finish Northern Berry School Part 2. We will have Grant McCarty, who you heard briefly, talking with us about diseases and insects. And I'll kick us off next week with talking about management for blueberries and the brambles. So if you are a teacher, just a reminder that evaluation link has been going out. And while Candice was talking, I got a few of those back. So I do know that that box link is working. If you have any problems, go ahead and email me and I'll get you the copy itself to send out. If you're a master volunteer, just log your hours like normal. And unless Candice has anything else, I'm ready to say good night, or good night. Good afternoon.
You wish.
I do, because I didn't sleep well last night. But
nope,
I would say good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks everybody.